Welcome, Campfire Crew. Let's get it on. Old Lady and Her Sock by Painling. I work as an AEMT equivalent in Germany. One time an old woman called us because her foot was bleeding. Nothing unusual so far, so we drove out without any expectations of what was waiting for us. We arrived, rang the bell, and the daughter of the old woman opened the door. The first thing I noticed was the incredibly awful smell of decay or something rotten. The daughter showed us the way to her mom, and the more we came nearer, the worse the smell became. From the inside, the house looked very messy, as contrary to the first sight of the house from the outside. We approached the old woman, and she was wearing very dirty, yellowish-brownish stained clothes and had very greasy hair. But we still wondered where this awful smell was coming from. I, at this point, had coughed multiple times because the smell was getting more and more intense. We asked the woman what happened, and she told us that she hurt her foot and now it was bleeding. What she described as blood was a dirty 1-month-old sock soaked in a brown-red mixture of blood, pus, and old ichor. We asked her how long she had been wearing it. That's why we knew it was 1 month old. My partner tried to remove the sock to see how bad the infection had become, and as he pulled the sock off only to her ankle, a handful of maggots fell out of the sock to the ground. A flash of the worst smell of my life nearly got me to puke, and my partner resigned pretty quickly to removing the sock even further and putting 2 bandages around the sock. We drove her straight to the emergency room. Waiting there was a pain in the ass too because the smell was so incredibly horrible. After we handed her over, we asked ourselves how the hell she didn't have septic symptoms already, or at least a fever. To this day, I'll remember what the woman said as we asked her why she didn't change the sock or go to a doctor earlier. She said, and translated from German, "Last Friday it itched a bit, but I'm not feeling anything anymore." My EMT Stories by a guy named Jesus. I was working a nice Sunday night last summer, and we hadn't seen a car or motorcycle wreck all day long, so we were waiting for it. It's almost a safe bet on nice Sundays to have at least one wreck in our rural response area. Sitting at the dinner table shooting the shit about the local drug seekers when tones dropped for a car wreck. Heading that way when police hit us on the radio to tell us it's car versus deer. I've never hit a deer, but I've seen plenty of wrecks, so I'm thinking, okay, pretty straightforward run. Police chime back in that they are pretty sure the guy is DOA. We roll up on the scene, and lo and behold, this dude is fucked. Blood everywhere. Picture this. Deer, a large buck, went through the windshield, antlers first, driver's side. Thrashing around and flaying this guy alive for a few seconds, I'm guessing. Deer had cut itself pretty badly going in and bled out, but not before ripping this guy's chest open and making him unrecognizable by any standard. Probably the most blood in a wreck I have ever seen. On another normal shift this last winter, it was cold as balls. We get a lovely welfare check call. The I haven't seen old man Jim for 2 weeks kind of shit from the neighbor. I'd say 90% of these we walk in with police and find a corpse. This time was even worse. Some old lady hadn't been seen for 2 weeks and it's snowing. Police knock and crack open the door. Bam! Instant corpse smell times 100. God damn, I'm getting my mask on and I walk in looking for the body amid a semi-hoarder lifestyle house. Boots sticking to the carpet and eyes watering. We got to the bathroom and the smell was unbearable. We opened the door and fucking human soup. Lady must have died taking a bath rotting in lukewarm water for upwards of 2 weeks. If you're not aware, bodies decompose differently in water. If it was summer and this happened, it would have been worse, but it still was pretty bad. I'm talking fresh floating, and the water was a grimy green to brown color. Maggots coming in and out of various places, so I noped the fuck out of there. I got outside, ripped off my mask, and started puking. Police, of course, are laughing at me because they don't have to go in and declare the person dead. We do. Fucking worst smell ever. And here's the last one that I still have the occasional nightmare/dream about. Where I work, there's a lot of drugs, meth and heroin mostly. Unfortunately, a lot of teenage pregnancy as well. This all ties in, so bear with me. Combine those two and you get inexperienced druggy mothers who make mistakes. This night it was a rainy Thursday evening and we got a call for a car wreck with entrapment, meaning people were still in the car. We got on scene and fire and police are frantically searching the area. I send my partner over to check on patients and start assessment. No sooner than I point around, I see what the issue is. Mother hadn't secured kiddo properly, and due to the rain and such, I assumed she was going way too fast while she wrecked. Little kiddo went through the windshield. At the angle of the glass and the force at which he was thrown, he was decapitated. Bloody body mangled in the dash and head nowhere to be found. The mother did not know this and was freaking out. Police were distracting her, trying to get her help while we searched for the head of her kid. I ended up finding it quite bruised and disfigured, and I wrapped it in a towel to hide it from prying eyes. The firemen got into the car to secure the body. That was the toughest and most fucked up thing I've done, having to tell a mother drugged out of her mind that her kid was killed like that. Second time I've held a decapitated head in my hands, but first for a little kid. An Intimate Moment with the Devil by The Nosemaster. My partner and I got a call to transport a patient from a hospital ER to a psych facility in Los Angeles. When we arrived at the ER, the patient's nurse pulled us aside before we even got to see the patient and told her that, for a lack of a better word, this woman was possessed by the devil. I thought that a strange thing to say, as she was a medical professional in a Los Angeles emergency department and no doubt came across some crazy-ass shit on a daily basis. So for her to claim something as the work of evil supernatural forces was a bit strange, to say the least. I was the attending EMT, so I would be riding in the back with our patient, and my partner was to drive. I got the report from the nurse, who told me the patient was brought in by medics and cops after she attacked her husband with a kitchen knife when he got home from work. Apparently, this attack came out of nowhere, and the husband had no idea why she attacked him. According to the nurse, the patient has not said a single word since being brought in, and all she did was stare. She would track a specific individual if there were multiple in the room, and would not break contact until that specific person was out of sight. The nurse informed me that the patient is in 4-point restraints, which meant her wrists and ankles were tied down. The nurse also said that the restraints were a precaution, as she had been quite calm and cooperative with requests, despite not saying a single word. So my partner and I entered the room, and the patient was lying flat on her back as we entered. She was a petite Mexican woman in her mid-30s, and as soon as we entered the room, she sat straight up with her arms being pulled slightly back due to the restraints. She immediately fixated her gaze upon me and didn't break it. Yay! Her stare was both intense and hollow. Her eyes were wide but vacant, yet they instilled this subtle dread that I just couldn't explain. They reminded me of a cat at night when they're caught off guard. We told her who we were and that we were going to be transporting her to another hospital. She said nothing. I told her that we were going to undo her restraints for a moment so we can move her onto our gurney. She nodded slightly, which the nurse was surprised to see, and moved onto our gurney without incident. The entire time, her hollow gaze was yet to be broken. We redid the restraints, and my partner restrained her left wrist. I will later learn that my partner had yet to learn how to properly restrain an individual. We loaded her up into our ambulance and headed off to the psych facility, which was about 20 minutes away, but because of LA traffic, we ended up taking about 45 minutes. The ride started off smooth, and I was doing paperwork while the patient was calm yet unwavering in her locked gaze on me. That's when I noticed that she was moving around more than she had been. I looked up from my paperwork and saw that my partner had failed to properly tie the patient's left arm down. And that's when it happened. I glanced up at her face, and her stare was locked, but something was different. She looked distracted, despite her still staring at me. That's when I noticed a slight rhythmic bounce to my patient's head and her shoulders. I traced her movement to her left hand. She had pulled her gown up and was masturbating. I was caught off guard, to say the least, and had quickly moved from the bench seat which was at her side to the chair which is at her head, so I could tell my partner to hurry the fuck up because she was masturbating and that my partner didn't know how to properly put on a fucking restraint. She tracked my movement to the seat at her head and continued to pleasure herself. Her head was twisted in such a way that her body looked kind of like Emily Rose did in the movie Exorcism of Emily Rose. She continued to masturbate for what seemed like an eternity. The strange thing was that she never made any kind of expression that a normal person would make while rubbing one out. Her face was completely devoid of any kind of emotion, be it pleasure or pain, and her stoic gaze persisted the entire trip. She finished about 5 minutes before we got to the psych facility, and when she finished, she placed her hand on her belly and urinated on the gurney. We dropped her off at the psych facility, and the nurse there told us to undo her restraints and have her sit on one of their chairs. I complied and undid her restraints and had her stand up from the gurney. From the first time since we picked her up, she broke her gaze and looked down at the urine-soaked gurney sheet. After a few minutes, she looked back up at me and said, "Sorry." She then sat down and refused to stare at me any longer. That was by far my most unsettling call. My Short Time as an EMT. Submitted by Tanya D. So, I got into an EMS program when I was in high school in my hometown. I was always a tomboy and tended to hang out with guys more than girls, and that's not to say I didn't have a lot of girlfriends, but I just liked the stuff the guys were doing more than cheerleading and stuff like that. Outside of softball, my only big interest was in an explorers club run out of my town's volunteer fire department. I loved my class and thought I'd get my EMT certification as soon as I could, and then work while going to college and figure out if I wanted to pursue a career in it or just be a volunteer after a while. My classes helped out a lot, and I got certified not long after graduation. I started doing ride-alongs with the others at the local ambulance corps to learn as much as I could before fall classes started up. And let me tell you, the things I saw and did, well, you'll see the outcome at the end of this. Let me say right away that I'm not skittish about blood or wounds or anything like that. It was the people I interacted with that got to me, the depravity of some and the hopelessness of others. It was a serious crash course into what the world looks like when things don't go so well. Druggies, homeless people, older people that no one gives a shit about, it all starts to wear on you, and I was only doing this for a couple of weeks. I'd been to a few gunshot wound calls, some basic welfare checks on older folks that had gone silent with their families that weren't living in the area anymore, random first aid stuff and the like. But one night in August left me with a taste that I just couldn't get out of my mouth. It was late on a Wednesday evening, and 3 of us were in a standard transport, gassing up and getting some food while we waited for our next call. I was with 2 guys, let's say they're Dennis and Mike. We were just talking about baseball and general things, just passing the time. They were both 3 years older than me, but didn't treat me like the 18-year-old that I was, and as far as they were concerned, I was part of the team. It was just before 11 o'clock, and we got a call for a welfare check. It was an older woman whose life alert device went off, and she wasn't responding to the dispatcher. We got geared up, and off we went to the address. And it was out in farm country, and we had the windows down, and I remember thinking that it was such a nice night, and I was hoping that this would be a routine thing and all would be well. We got to the house, and it was set way back from the road on a long dirt driveway that led to what looked like was once a farm. There was a barn not too far from the house, and a bunch of outbuildings that were in various states of disrepair. Dennis drove right up to the front door, and we got our gear and bags and went up to it. Mike knocked, and there was no sound except for what sounded like a radio off somewhere inside. Mike checked the knob, and it turned, and he pushed the door open. A creepy, gross rotting smell came wafting out on us, and I recoiled before getting my act together. Mike went in and reached for a light switch or something, but he couldn't find one, so we all clicked on our mag lights and quickly found the place was a disaster of major proportions. Clearly a hoarder lived here, and the smell was insane. Rotting garbage, feces from what felt like hundreds of animals and humans probably. I mean, just all kinds of awfulness wrapped into a cloud of gross. We stepped forward, playing our lights around at boxes of stuff piled to the ceiling and pools of God knows what on the floor. Everything seemed sticky, if that makes sense, even the air. Each of us kept calling out for anyone that might be there, but there was just the sound of that radio somewhere in the back of the house. Dennis moved forward and opened a door to what was a bedroom, and the smell that came out was nearly overpowering. In the bed was the corpse of an old woman, laying on top of the sheets that were dark brown and crusted with a plastic sheet over her legs and waist that was literally stuck to what looked like multiple wounds that had once seeped out blood and bodily fluids. I mean, it really looked like a second skin. The woman had long been dead, at least a couple of days, and the flies and bugs were everywhere. I backed into the hallway as Dennis confirmed that she was gone. I swear at that moment I heard the radio get louder, and Mike and I looked at each other. In retrospect, the radio didn't get louder, but it did take our attention away from that woman and something else down the hall. We slowly followed the hall down to what we found was an even more disturbing sight. The floor was covered with blood, and there was a body of a 30-something man in the tub, naked, with down-the-street slashes on his wrists, a bottle of vodka at his side, and a shotgun next to him. Most of his head had been blown off, and pieces of skull and brain were stuck to the tile around a large blast hole behind his body. I gagged, and Mike got a closer look, and said that it likely happened a day ago. I nodded, and we heard Dennis calling out for more police and responders, so we went out and told him what we had found back there. As we all stood in the living room, I noticed something sitting on an old table with pictures on it. It was the life alert device that had been triggered that resulted in our call. It was nowhere near the bodies, unless someone had hit it and then run out of the house. I mean, there was no one there. Who the hell fired it? We stood waiting for the rest of the team when we heard a rustling sound in the corner. A box full of who knows what moved, and we all stood with our lights on it. Dennis and I went over to it and slowly pulled it away from the wall, and a little girl of about 8 or so, covered in filth, sat there curled up looking at us. "He hurt Grandma," was all she said, and we got her up and checked her vitals and scoured her for any wounds. She wasn't hurt at all, but it was clear she was a child of massive neglect. She didn't cry, she didn't do anything. We took her outside, and I went out to the truck and grabbed a stuffed animal. We kept a few of them in there for situations like this. We asked her where her mommy was, and she didn't know. And then we asked about her daddy, and all she said was, "Daddy hurt Grandma, and now he's hurt too." I gave her the stuffed bear, and she clung to it and asked if she could keep it. I told her yes, and she had the littlest of smiles on her face. The rest of the night was a lot of interviewing and reporting, and this is what I was able to piece together over the next few weeks. The girl had been kidnapped from her mother, who lived on the other side of the country and who was frantically looking for her. This guy who had the little girl was her father, but he had immediately taken off before she was born, and the mother had little to no information about who he really was or where he was from. It was a one-night stand gone wrong. Later on, the guy tracked the mother down and snatched the girl and brought her to his mother's house. They were there for a few weeks with the grandmother, who was mentally ill and a hoarder. It seemed like she was telling her son that he needed to stop what he was doing as far as what the little girl said, but the father got violently drunk and broke her legs and pelvis with a mattock and then covered her in plastic, all in front of this little kid. After a couple of days, he snapped even further and killed himself, leaving the little girl alone in that shithole with 2 dead bodies. Somehow, she had figured out how to activate the life alert device, but I don't know how. The little girl got reunited with her mother, who turned out to be a good woman. She had just made a terrible mistake a long time ago, and it ended up coming back to haunt her. After all that, I decided I didn't want to be an EMT or a paramedic anymore and started nursing school. I'm now an RN in an old folks home, and I love what I do. But I'll never forget that house, that scene, and that little girl who had no idea what was going on around her. I know I won't forget, but I hope in time she does. How Did He Live? By Michael James, 78. When I first started working as a paid EMT, I responded to a call where a biker had laid his bike down going around a curve. We thought it would be the usual road rash and maybe a few broken bones. When we pulled onto the scene, the state trooper was standing at his trunk of his patrol car, and hands on the lid, puking up his last meal. And then I saw the victim standing about 8 or 10 feet in front of where the Harley had come to rest against a curb. He was holding his midsection and slowly shuffling towards the wrecked bike. As I got closer, all the puzzle pieces came together. The drunk biker took the curve too fast, laid the bike down on its sides going about 30 or 40 miles an hour when it hit the raised curb, and it launched the rider over the handlebars. Well, almost. The brake lever impaled his abdomen and eviscerated his intestines. I have no idea how many feet were pulled out because he was following the trail back to the bike and stuffing the dirt and sand-covered organ back through his wound as he went. We got him to stop, placed him on a stretcher, and untangled the remaining mess from the bike. Not much we could do for him other than clean them off for the best we could and keep them moist. Throughout all this, he never passed out. From what I heard a few days later, he lived minus several feet of intestines and will be pooping in a bag for some time. Here's a story on a lighter note, and it's a little bit funny. I got dispatched for a 3-year-old with an unknown foreign object lodged in his nose. Why these people called 911 was beyond me. I mean, the kid was obviously upset, but in no real danger. We arrived on scene, and I used my light to see if I would be able to remove the object in the field without further harm. It wasn't too deep in the nasal passage, and I was able to use a pair of hemostats to gently pull it free. It turns out it was a small tire removed from a Matchbox car. The parents were relieved, the kid was perfectly fine, and we headed out without transport. I pulled down the road a little ways to fill out my pre-hospital care report before advising dispatch I was ready to go back into service. While finishing the report, we got a radio call. 913. 913 here, go ahead. 913, we need you to respond back to 123 Tire Sniffer Street. Okay, I'm on my way. Did they disclose the nature of the problem? Not really. They advised it relates to the initial call. So we got back to the home 2 or 3 minutes later, concerned that the toddler had injuries I had overlooked on my initial assessment. I walk right over to the kid and start reassessing, but the mother touched my shoulder and said, "No, not him. It's his father." Wouldn't you know, this grown man in his mid-30s had taken the tire from me after I removed it from his son's nose. After I left, he stuck it up his own nose. "I just didn't understand how it would get stuck," was his last statement. Once again, hemostats to the rescue. Tire was removed and we left once again. This time, I brought that damn tire with me. I Almost Quit, submitted by NA Firefighter. This happened when I was just a probie with my town's volunteer fire company. I'd been an explorer for 2 years and did spend a lot of time at the hall on the fringes of fires, but obviously not right in the thick of things. Once I turned 18 and got fully accepted as a member of the crew, I started to gain more experience and started to learn more and more about the job. Let me say straight out on the top that I'm still a volunteer, a different part of the state and a different crew, but I love what I do and I take my oath seriously. It can be tough and devastating, as all firefighters know, but it's also some of the most rewarding things I've ever experienced in my life. Early on in my service, though, I almost gave it all up. It was in the summer of that year that we got a call for a rager, a fire in a 2-story house that was quickly spreading, and it looked like the houses next door were also in jeopardy. I had my blue lights on in my pickup truck and was getting there as fast as I could. When I got there, it was being handled as best it could be, but it turned into a 3-bagger, and later 2 more companies were on their way to help out. Like we thought, the wind spread the flames to the building next door, and for some reason, the occupants had not come out of their house, and there was confusion as to if there was anyone even inside. Someone had gone over and rang the bell and pounded on the doors, but no one answered. My chief told me to go over and make sure anyone inside was getting out before things got worse, and if anyone was in there, how they didn't feel the heat from next door or smell the smoke was a mystery to all of us. So, me and a partner were busting ass to the front door of this place that is now engulfed on the top floor, and the fire is now downstairs, too. Before we hit the first step of the porch, the front door blasted open, and out comes this screaming woman carrying a small child, and it seems like she's slipping or sliding across the porch as she moves towards us. My partner scooped her up, and I took the child, and there were paramedics right behind us in a flash, as we were asking if there was anyone else in the house. She kept screaming, "No, no," and to keep my child safe, keep my baby safe. We did, and they were okay, but when we turned her over to the guys in the gut wagon, I looked down and realized why it looked like she was running funny. Her feet were basically melting off her legs. She was so far gone into shock, I don't think she even knew it. From what we learned, she was asleep in an upstairs room when the fire hit her place and the flames surrounded her. She jumped up and ran to get her kid, and the carpeting and fire and whatever else was on the floor basically stuck to her feet, burning them severely, and she just barreled down the stairs and out the door as her flesh was disintegrating. For a moment, I almost puked, and I stepped off to the side before getting my act together and getting back into things. Honestly, I forgot about it for the next 3 hours, but when things were contained, it came back to me, and I seriously questioned if I had the stomach for this kind of work. Someone told the chief and lieutenant how I was doing after my first big job, and they came over to talk with me. I told them about the woman's feet, and I just couldn't get it out of my head, and they just nodded. My chief looked at me and said, "Hey, we've all been there. Stick with it. You're a good Jake." I'll never forget him saying that. It's been 24 years, and I look back and tell myself, the reason you got into this job was to help a person like that woman. I've never forgotten it either. I saw her years later at school at a function for my daughter. She had lost both of her feet, but learned to walk with prosthetics and was very active in the PTO. I'm not sure what happened because we moved right after that. I hope she's still doing well. I also hope you share my story, Josh. Thanks if you do. To all my brothers out there, stay safe. Complacency. The familiar click of the speakers turning on let me know we were all getting a call about a second before the tones went off. If you're used to working at my station, you can hear that quiet click over all kinds of ambient noise. We were being dispatched for a residential fire alarm. We roll on a lot of false alarms. Residential fire alarms are almost always the result of someone overcooking their dinner or a bag of popcorn. So many false alarms can lead to complacency, just like the villagers in the story of the boy who cried wolf. We were just like those villagers, unprepared to act when the time came. We pulled up to the 3-unit apartment complex and found the courtyard between the building and the one next to it full of people, including a lot of kids. It was a weekend, and it wasn't too cold, and it wasn't too late in the evening. Besides, the fire department was coming. Everyone likes to see a spectacle. My captain and I were both turned out, but neither of us had our bottles on. There was no smoke. This was another false alarm. We headed over to the apartment and someone approached us. They said that they lived above the unit in question, and they heard the smoke detector going off below them and smelled something like burning food. They had knocked on the door, but no one answered. It wouldn't be the first time that we've been to a house where someone left a pot on the stove. We knocked on the door again just to be sure, and we also checked the windows. They were all closed and locked, and the curtains were drawn. The windows and the door were also cool to the touch, so there was little concern. We determined that the renters and the manager had been called, but there was no answer. With the indications we had that something wasn't right, my captain gave me the word. It was forcible entry time. Let me just take a moment to say how much I love being a firefighter. It's fun, especially at times like this. I was already lined up with the front door, and I did a forward kick that would have made my kid's MMA instructor proud. When the door flew back, I was greeted by a wall of smoke that extended from the ceiling to the ground. Crap. My captain and I ran back to the rig to grab our bottles, and we should have had them on already. Again, crap, I hate that feeling. I grabbed the pack from my seat and threw it on while I walked back to the apartment. Now the crowd had moved back. No one wanted to get in our way, and by the time I reached the door, I was masked up. I stepped up to the doorway and then disappeared into the smoke. While the entire place was filled with smoke, it wasn't thick and black. There was also no accompanying heat. The fire had snuffed itself out, suffocated, starved for oxygen. I made my way to the kitchen and found that there was indeed a pot on the stove with the burner going. The family had placed several baby bottles in a pot of boiling water to sterilize them, and forgotten about it. Once the water had boiled off, the plastic started to burn, and the knobs on the stove were melted and the paint on the wall was charred and blistered. We opened the windows and doors and used a fan to remove the smoke, and then we removed the burnt items out of the house and then disconnected the stove and moved it to the center of the kitchen. With all of that done, we again checked to make sure the fire hadn't moved into the walls or the cabinets. It could have been much worse. At least they had working smoke detectors, and I learned a valuable lesson about complacency. Crazy People, submitted by Firefighter23. I wanted to relate these stories to you because I'm a big fan of your YouTube, and I'm also a firefighter. This first story took place about 15 years ago in a rural part of the town that I live in. We only have one company that I volunteer with, so we get sent out on a lot of calls out in the boonies. This one time it was just about Thanksgiving, and a person called in about a fire on a property out past my place. So I got ready, kissed my wife and kids goodbye, and they told me to be safe, and off I went. I drove over to the place and was the first one there, as I did live close by, and it was going to be a few minutes before any of my brothers would show up. I saw smoke and I smelled it, but I could tell right away it wasn't coming from the house, the car parked outside, or a barn that was in the back. So I walk around the side of the building and can see that it looks like a leaf fire or something is out of control and spreading across the ground. I grab my cell, call it into the chief, and then run back to my truck to get my fire extinguisher I always keep in the cab. I ran back and put out the fire. It really wasn't all that big. And that's when I heard this moaning noise, like someone was just waking up. I noticed what looks like blood on the ground, and there's a trail of it leading from a pile of wood towards the barn. Someone had been chopping wood near the leaf fire, but they weren't there anymore. So of course I thought maybe someone was in trouble because of the blood. And I was right. I followed the trail of blood to the side door of the barn, and I peeked into a little room, and there, laying on the floor, was the homeowner holding a bloody axe. He was just laying there and moaning, and I could see blood pooling underneath his foot and what looked like a pile of grapes on top of his foot. It was coagulated blood. I immediately called the chief again, who was close by, and I could hear our trucks coming down the road, too. I started giving the guy first aid after I established he was awake enough for me to talk to him, and his breath reeked of beer, and he was clearly more than 3 sheets to the wind. My brothers finally pulled in, and an ambulance had been called too, and we kept the guy talking through his blood loss and drunkenness, and we began to piece together what had happened. The guy had been drinking all day, and then for some reason decided it was time to burn some leaves in his bonfire pit. Then he decided to chop some wood for a fire in his fireplace for later that night. Then he slipped with a swing of his axe and basically cleaved his right foot in two from the toes down to the middle of his foot. I suppose I should mention he was doing all of this barefoot, right? Yeah, real smart. He crawled into the barn for some reason instead of crawling to his house, and eventually the fire got out of hand, and that's when a neighbor called it in. While we were working on him, he kept asking us for another beer, practically oblivious to the fact of what he'd done. I will never forget the way his foot looked. Seriously, I'm not kidding, it looked like someone plopped a bunch of grapes on his foot. Totally gross. My other story is kind of a nick-of-time story that didn't happen to me, but happened to the guy who got me into my company that I volunteer with. I'll call him Joe for this story. Joe was hanging around the fire hall one morning helping wash the trucks for a big town parade coming up, when a call came in from an apartment building. A person on the first floor was complaining of a noxious odor coming from somewhere, but it wasn't like that rotten egg smell you get with natural gas warnings. They called the gas company anyway, and they all got on over to the building to check it out. From the outside, Joe said everything was kosher, but the man who called was waiting in the doorway of the apartment building, ready to lead the guys to his place to check things out. Joe asked if the landlord had been contacted, and the guy said he called and left a message, but the landlord wasn't a local and lived somewhere out of town. The guys went into his apartment, and there definitely was a noxious odor that they all thought smelled something like lighter fluid, but not quite. They checked the guy's stove and oven, and they were fine. Pilot lights were burning blue, and there were no leaks. So Joe goes down to the basement where the meter is, and things are looking good there as well. By now, a guy from the gas company had arrived, and he checked over everything, and all was kosher, as I said. I couldn't figure it out. By now, the other tenants had come out of their places to see what was going on, and our guys asked if they could check on their places as well. The other person downstairs' place was fine, and the person on the second floor above them was also okay. So they knock on the fourth apartment door, and no one answers. The other tenants say a woman and her son live there, but no one had seen them that morning or for a little while for that matter. Joe knocked on the door again, and then got down on the floor to see if the smell might be coming from inside, and he caught a faint whiff of the funny smell. Someone got the landlord on the phone, and they got permission to break the door down. So boom, door goes in, followed by Joe and the crew, and they stumble onto a terrible scene. The woman and her 6 or 7-year-old son were duct taped to chairs in the living room, like totally wrapped up with only their noses visible. There was some kind of liquid all over the floor, and a candle burning down just a few feet away from them. Joe orders a guy to call the police, and they put out the candle and start to check on the woman and her kid. They were really sluggish and barely responding to the help that arrived, and the police came and there was a huge investigation, and what came out is a true horror show. The woman's ex-boyfriend had come over the night before and drugged their food without them knowing, while he was pleading with her to get back together. The woman said no, and the guy waited for them to fall asleep from the drugs, and when they did, he taped them to the chairs, dumped some kind of flammable liquid all over them and the floor, and then put a candle down in a way that it would fall over after it burned down a ways and he was long gone. Please forgive me, I can't remember what the liquid was called. I almost didn't send this story because of that. So yeah, this guy was going to burn his ex-girlfriend and her kid alive, and likely the whole building down too, and no one would ever have known what was going on. Both of them were okay, and the fire inspector said they were lucky their neighbor called, because it was only a matter of maybe another half hour before the guy's plan would have started rolling. Joe always talked about what a close call that was, and how if they hadn't checked around as fast as they did, that woman and her son might not have made it out of there alive. The scariest part? To my knowledge, the guy who did it was never caught. My Firefighter Horror Stories by Angry Brute. Since I'm in a sharing mood, I feel like discussing the horrific events that I've seen in my former years as a volunteer firefighter. A wonderful experience it was as a whole, but there were still some very haunting moments that plague my mind to this day. I was in high school at this point in time, and I always kept my radio in my truck in case I got a call when I left. Sure enough, one day that thing went off and said, "Winnie Stoll Volunteer Fire Department, please be en route to a 1050 major." That's code for a bad wreck. This was not a bad wreck like you would expect it to be. It was not some pile-up or a collision of two or more vehicles. No, it just so happened to be a motorcycle, a crotch rocket to be exact. This guy had the bright idea to nearly top 200 miles per hour on his bike on a highway. He was going so fast, he didn't notice the gaping pothole in front of him. His front tire hit it, and it threw him and the bike head over tail for more than 100 yards. It literally tore him down to nothing. The same happened with his bike. Where his remains ended, his bike began several feet onward. Just a heap of remains in front of what seemingly looked like red paint. There was nothing we could do, really, besides clear the bike and create a containment zone. Just seeing something like that gave me a new outlook and gratefulness to be alive. The dumbest of things can go so wrong so fast. I mean, literally, just before we got there, this guy was alive, and at that moment, he was gone. My next story is one that was during the aftermath of Hurricane Ike. Now I guess you know where I live. We got called out to help search and rescue after the storm had passed, and we had to go down to the beach, which was about 15 minutes from us. The storm reshaped out entire coastlines. Houses, land, everything had gone into the Gulf. The place pretty much looked like the wasteland in Fallout 3, only much more surreal. Well, once we were on the scene, we started off searching the houses on the bay side. The houses were nothing more than twigs, and the cars were all piled up together in the water or buried halfway in the sand. We started searching this one ruined house, and what we found was, for lack of a better word, horrifying. 4 bodies were in there, covered in sand and pale as the clouds. It was very easy to tell that they were a family because it was a husband and wife and 2 children. Goddamn, children! They couldn't have been more than 7 years old. We noticed they had markings on their arms. It was faint, but you could still make it out. They had written their social security numbers on each of their arms for identification. Now, before the storm hit this area, everyone was under mandatory evacuation orders. Yet these people stayed and kept their children in harm's way. I don't know them, but to put your own kids in that kind of a place with a storm coming, I still don't know what possessed them to believe that it was a good idea to this day. An entire family gone because they did not heed the warnings given to them. If you can only imagine my anger when I saw that. Warehouse Fire by Scott. Most of the things we see as firefighters aren't really appropriate for public discussion. But the one thing I can say that scared the ever-living crap out of me, and I don't think it's the scariest thing I've ever done, but it is something I can comment on, was a fire in a large warehouse that had huge vats of formaldehyde and a few other hazardous materials, either burning or right in the fire. The fire had been burning for a few hours prior to the original fire department's call going out. They called a box alarm, means calling for help from surrounding fire departments, and we responded with our ladder truck. It was about a 5-story building in height, but had no individual floors, just an open floor plan. Our crew was asked to ventilate the roof, but when we got up on it, you could feel the roof bowing and moving. My captain made the decision to continue on, because the building really needed to be ventilated. 3 of us had to carry our saws and axes towards the area directly over the fire in full gear and breathing from our air packs. To minimize the risks to us, we also carried a roof ladder in between our legs as we crossed to where we needed to be. This was in case a hole opened up in the roof. We would land on the ladder between our legs, and hopefully the hole wouldn't be bigger than the ladder. It was the quickest job of ventilating I have ever done. We cut our hole in the roof and made a rapid exit, all the while sweating bullets. I can't say it was the right decision to do so. We had many discussions with our captain afterwards as to the safety of doing it. But all firefighters know they will sometimes go up against life-threatening situations, and in this case, the roof wasn't opening up on its own, as we had hoped, and we needed to release the superheated air and smoke out to make it a little safer for the crews going inside to fight the fire. I decided afterwards that I would never do something that dangerous again, unless a life depended on it. Needless to say, I won't go into any of the emergency rescue calls we've had to go on, as they can be very traumatizing just to talk about them. The School Fires, submitted by Torchy LaFlame. Heard the call for firefighter stories, so here I am. What I'm about to tell you took place in the fall of 1990. I lived in a suburb of Chicago and was 26 at the time, and I'd been a volunteer fireman for 6 years at that point when this all went down. I'm not making any of this up, and the guys I was with this night still tell this story. It was a Saturday night, and I was hanging out at our hall because my girlfriend was out of town, and the place had just been built. Back then, you could still have a bar area, and we had a huge big screen TV and a pool table, all kinds of stuff to relax with when you weren't out on calls. And no, you couldn't drink if you were on a call, and you certainly couldn't go to a call if you had been, so don't bring that up in the comments. Anyway, we were playing NHL 91 on Sega, and a call came in through dispatch that came from the area middle school. The weird thing was that it came from a classroom, which would be highly irregular, seeing it was a Saturday night, and no one should have been in the school. The first call was a hang-up, but 2 more came in, and the dispatcher, a wonderful woman named Josette, said she could faintly hear someone saying, "There's a fire." So we gear up and head over after our chief called the superintendent of the school and the building principal to let them know we got the call. We sent 1 truck, our medic detail, and a town police officer came out with us too. When we got there, there was no visible smoke or flames that we could see, but that doesn't really mean anything. If it was contained inside, we might be able to work it without spreading. The school principal told us that no one was on staff that night, and that he'd meet us over there. So my partners Sean and Brad accessed the building while 2 others waited for the word outside. The police officer was this old guy named Bill, and he came inside with us. We started to check out the first floor and found nothing. Sean ran down to the basement and came up a minute later and said all was well. Second floor suite was the same thing. Not a thing was out of place. Dispatch called out and said whoever was calling did so again 3 times since we entered the building, and when we got to the 3rd floor, we all smelled smoke. We immediately changed attitudes from vigilant to hyper-aware and followed the scent of the smoke. I'll tell you right now, there was no actual smoke, just the smell of it on the air. We didn't see anything. We went room to room, and Brad stopped for 1 second in a room and yelled out, "Hey, there's somebody in there!" The rest of us were on the other side of the hallway and ran over to look in the door window and to get to work on opening it. But I stopped when I didn't see anything. Neither did Sean. Neither did Bill, but Brad insisted that he had seen someone standing in the room. Just then the principal, a guy named Larry or Harry or something like that, came jogging up to us with his keys jingling. Bill asked him to open the door, and he did. We got inside, and there was nothing but an empty chemistry room. The smell of smoke was gone, and we all just kind of stood there looking at each other with questioning looks. Dispatch said the call came in again, but we radioed back saying there was nothing wrong at the school. Then Larry, or whatever, piped in and said, "I'll be dipped in shit." Brad looked at him and said, "What?" You guys aren't going to believe this, but this is the story. Back in the late 60s, there was a kid who got killed up here. Well, more to the point, he killed himself. We all stood there looking at him like he was bullshitting us, but he told us this crazy story that I later found out was 100% true. This young guy had found out that at the end of his senior year in high school, and this used to be the high school and was now a middle school. Anyway, this guy found out that his girlfriend was dumping him. He had been denied entry into the army, and his brother had been killed in Vietnam. All of this happened within like a month, and he was a wreck, obviously, and he snapped. He broke into the school, went to his old chemistry room, and doused himself with gas or something flammable, set himself on fire with one of the classroom's Bunsen burners. I wouldn't have believed it if we all didn't look into it later. It was all true, and there's even a plaque in the school in memorial of the guy. I went back later and looked at it. So the kicker? They determined that the calls to us about the fire were coming from that room we had been in. It was pretty close to the anniversary of the date that he took his life. As for what Brad saw, I don't know, but I believe him. Too many weird things happened that night to just be a coincidence, and he certainly could not have known about the suicide or what room it happened in before we got there. So, yeah, no courageous stories of me saving a family of 5 or licking the flames of death, although some of that has happened in my career. This was just one strange call. Nothing like that has ever happened to me again. What happened in Webster? Okay guys, this isn't a first-person story, but it is a retelling of a true story that happened in a town about an hour from me. It hits close to home because I have family that lives in this town, I have friends who live in that town, and I did spend a lot of time there when I was in college, was dating a girl from that area as well. So, this is just a retelling of what actually happened in December of 2012. In the early morning of December 24th, 2012, firefighters responded to a fire in West Webster, New York, a suburb of Rochester. They were fired upon by a 62-year-old William H. Spengler, who is believed to have deliberately set the fire. 2 of the firefighters were killed. According to police, Spengler set his house and the family car on fire at 191 Lake Road in the early morning hours of Christmas Eve, and then armed himself with 3 weapons: a Smith & Wesson .38 caliber revolver, a Mossberg 12-gauge shotgun, and a .223 caliber Bushmaster semi-automatic rifle. When firefighters arrived shortly after 5:30 a.m., Spengler ambushed them from an earthen berm across the street from his house. Spengler exchanged shots with police, who arrived with an armored truck to remove the firefighters and 33 nearby civilians. Spengler ran after getting shot at and died when he shot himself in the head. His body was discovered about 6 hours later. Due to the shooting, fire crews were unable to resume fighting the blaze until 11:30 a.m. By then, 6 other houses had burned to the ground, and 2 others had been rendered uninhabitable. A severely burned body found inside Spengler's house is believed to be Spengler's 67-year-old sister Cheryl, with whom he was living. The shooting is suspected as following an argument between Spengler and his sister. A 3-page typewritten letter written by Spengler was also found at the scene. It reflected Spengler's intent to ambush first responders, but offered no motive for the shooting. In it he wrote, quote, "I still have to get ready to see how much of the neighborhood I can burn down, and do what I like doing best: killing people." The 2 firefighters killed in the shooting were 43-year-old Michael Schiaparini, past chief of the West Webster Fire District and lieutenant and public information officer for the Webster Police Department. He was killed along with 19-year-old Tomasz Kaczała, who was also working as a 911 dispatcher. The 2 wounded firefighters were Joseph Hofstetter, who was shot in the pelvis, with the bullet then lodging in his spine, and Theodore Scardino, who was shot in the chest and knee. Both were hospitalized at Strong Memorial Hospital for serious injuries and were declared to be in stable condition. In addition to the 2 wounded firefighters, police officer John Ritter was slightly injured when a bullet hit the windshield of his car. Spengler had previously spent 17 years in prison for murdering his 92-year-old grandmother with a hammer in 1980. He had not attracted the attention of police since then. William Spengler could not stand his sister Cheryl, according to a friend. Spengler's mother, Arlene, to whom he was said to have been close to, had died 2 months earlier to the shooting. Investigators immediately began focusing on how Spengler obtained the gun. New York, like many other states, bars convicted felons from buying, owning, or possessing a firearm. Before the day was out, agents with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms discovered that the Bushmaster rifle and the shotgun had been purchased in June 2010 at Gander Mountain in Henrietta, another Rochester suburb. The owner of record was Dawn Nguyen, a neighbor of Spengler, who had recently moved to the suburb of Greece. In an interview with agents that night, Nguyen admitted to buying the guns, but claimed that they had been stolen. However, according to investigators, Nguyen texted a Monroe County Sheriff's deputy the next day and admitted buying the guns for Spengler in an illegal straw purchase. On December 28th, William Hochul, the United States Attorney for the Western District of New York, announced that Nguyen had been arrested and charged with knowingly making a false statement in connection with the purchase of a firearm from a federal firearms licensee. She also faced state charges of filing a false business record, the form she filled out stating that she was the owner of the guns. In 2014, Nguyen was sentenced to 8 years in prison for her involvement. As part of the New York SAFE Act, the New York Penal Law section on aggravated murder added the Webster provision named for this incident. It amended the legislation to increase penalties for murdering a first responder to life in prison without parole. A child's footprint. Back when I was working as a cop on a military base, I loved working night shift. Didn't deal with 99% of the bullshit that the day shift had to deal with, and what little stuff we did deal with was usually really interesting. Almost every building on a base is alarmed, and the alarms are tied right into the desk, so we know the instant they go off. When we get an alarm activation, we close the base and go check the building, pull on all the doors, see if we can get in, that sort of thing. If we can, we go into the building and secure it. Check all the doors and corners to see if someone set the alarm off. Well, one night I was on patrol with my Alpha, and we get called to respond to an alarm activation at the elementary school. So we go, secure the building, and call in that the building is all secure. No problem. We kept patrolling. About 15 or 20 minutes go by, and we get another alarm activation. We get back out there and check, and now there is a maintenance door open that leads into a boiler room. Nothing in it, so we close it, lock it, and get out. Another 20 minutes, another alarm. We respond, and all the doors are still locked, and we can't get in. And the maintenance door is locked too. We call in the all clear. This time my buddy and I sit on opposite sides of the school and watch to see if someone is coming and yanking on the doors hard enough to set the alarms off. We're sitting there watching, and nothing happens. And right as we're about to leave, another alarm activation goes off as we're sitting there. We inform the desk that we'd like the building manager on site to help us secure the interior and to let us in. It's now like 3 a.m. The building custodian shows up and we start doing a walkthrough, checking all the classrooms and checking all the maintenance rooms. And that's when we see one of the maintenance doors open with the lights on in the room. Now, this room is literally the size of a closet. We walk down there and look in. No one's there, and it's the kind of door that locks when it closes. We look in there and we find a single footprint of a bare foot made in water. It was from a small child. Freaked the living hell out of us because no one reported a missing child, and the entire building was clear and still locked up. No one left, no one entered, and we checked every inch of that damn place, literally a 3-hour deep sweep, including ceiling tiles. Freaked the ever-loving shit out of us, and to this day, my partner refuses to go into that school. I gotta admit, schools are really fucking spooky when they're empty. Suicide contact. I'm a security patrol officer in Scottsdale, Arizona, and I work 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. I have the largest security beat in the Scottsdale desert, and part of my job is to respond to alarm calls in these isolated mansions throughout Scottsdale, Cave Creek, and Carefree. One night, I got an alarm call at a small airport where the rich play with their airplanes. It's called Sky Ranch Airport. Part of the airport is residential homes with built-in hangars, and that's where this alarm was tripped one morning at 02:30. On arrival, I went through the normal alarm process. Called dispatch to make a call to the homeowners, and no one was supposed to be there. It was vacant. After I made the call, I knocked on the front door very aggressively, just to make sure if someone was there, they'd hear me before I made entry. In the past, I've walked in on homeowners when they didn't know I was coming. Anyway, as I walked towards the front door, I heard a little shuffling noise behind it. Very faint, but loud enough to be noticed. That being the case, I rang the doorbell and knocked on the door longer than usual. But nothing. So I then began the perimeter check, and I found the back sliding door handle was broken, but there was a little note on the inside that read, "Handle broken," and the realtor's name was signed to it. The realtor had also placed a metal rod down to keep the sliding door from opening. I finished the perimeter check and then called dispatch to let them know I was going to make entry. The house was beautiful, and everything was fine, so I wrote out my entry slip and was resetting the alarm. But a fault showed up on the display that read, Zone 35 back room door. And at that very moment, my supervisor called me via radio and asked if I knew anything about the house I was in. What he told me, more than anything, just annoyed the shit out of me. He said back in 2008, the previous homeowner had committed suicide by the front door with a shotgun when the economy crashed. He'd left behind a wife and 3 kids. I know he was just trying to scare me, so I brushed it off and resumed my business. I walked to the backsliding door, and lo and behold, the metal rod had been removed, and the sliding door was open about 4 inches. I gotta admit, it was really creepy. The house had motion sensors, including sensors on the door itself, and none of them were showing up as fault. I put the rod back into its original place and armed the system. A few months later, I had an alarm call at a different house, and this time Scottsdale police assisted me. After the call was over and done with, we stood outside the house bullshitting, and I asked the police if they knew about the house in Sky Ranch Airport where the guy had supposedly killed himself. One of the officers said he was one of the first officers on scene shortly after the homeowner blew his brains out, and yeah, that did happen. They confirmed the suicide, and if I ever have to respond to that house again, I'm going with backup. A bizarre abduction. My old roommate's dad was a former naval officer and then an FBI agent. 20 years in the Navy and 12 or 15 years or so in the FBI. One of his strangest stories was from his FBI days, and I'll paraphrase it here. It was a kidnapping case. This girl disappeared from her grandparents' RV sometime between 5 p.m. and midnight. They were up in front on the road, and the next thing they know, she was gone. She was supposed to be sleeping in the back. One stop at a rest stop, then they were in stop-and-go traffic, so they figure she must have popped out the door at some point. This happened near the California-Nevada border. So we met them again and talked to them, and this is within a day or so, and the girl's still missing. No sign of her. She was only 15. Local PD theory is she ran off because she's 15 and wants to get away from her lame grandparents for the summer. But there's a busted window with glass inside the vehicle, so we're treating it like a possible kidnapping. After a few hours, there's a couple of different theories on the case still. Again, one that she ran off, another that she got snatched. Nobody's seen the girl in almost 2 days now, and disappearing in the desert for a young girl is not an easy thing to do. Next thing you know, we got a phone call. A report of a naked girl, lost and confused, picked up by some trucker on a 2-lane road out in a town called Nipton. It runs into I-15 between Barstow and Vegas, right near the border. She matches our description, so me and 3 guys head out there to meet with the sheriff who's got her. Turns out she's our girl. Turns out she's fine, No bruises, no exposure, no rape, nothing. Completely healthy, completely fine. Even cleaned up like she just took a shower. Wouldn't tell us a damn thing because she couldn't remember a damn thing. According to her, 1 minute she was in the RV, and the next she was naked walking down the side of the road in 100-degree heat. We talked to her for 2 hours while her grandparents headed out to pick her up. We had our social services lady talk to her. Nothing. Over my career, I've seen people hiding things. This girl wasn't hiding anything. She honestly didn't remember. Damnedest thing. Anyway, the girl was found, she was fine, so we turned her back over to the local PD to figure out what happened and determined if any charges needed to be pressed. I kept in touch with a guy I knew out there because I was curious to hear what would happen with this story, and we also happened to be in a fantasy football league together. A few months later, he told me the parents sent the girl to a therapist to look for repressed memories to make sure she wasn't raped or something. The therapist said she seemed fine, and honestly had no recollection of her time at all, and doesn't think there's any point to delving much further into things, and she has no symptoms, and is largely more confused by the reaction than the event. So, to this day, we've got a busted RV window with glass on the inside, likely from a moving RV on a jam-packed freeway or something, likely in broad or lightly fading sunlight, and 0 witnesses. A 15-year-old gets out, or is taken out, and is taken somewhere safe nearby for almost 2 days, and then is stripped naked without being touched sexually, cleaned up, and deposited on the side of a separate road a few miles away. She didn't have a drug in her system. She remembers nothing at all, and nobody knows what happened to her clothes or anything else. It's been almost 20 years since this happened, and I can't figure out what the hell went on with that girl. It still bugs me at night that I have no way to explain it aside from saying that she just lied the entire time. But I know liars, and I am sure she wasn't lying at all. Backwoods Scumbags, submitted by Officer John. This took place in 2006. It was my 10th year as a Leo. I'm not saying exactly where this happened, and you can call me John, as what I'm sharing with you and your listeners can't be linked back to me. Leos see and deal with all kinds of shit that most people would not know what to do with, and none of us are perfect. There's so much going wrong in the world today, and we all have a microscope pointed at us that it's hard to even write this. I want to say this from the get-go. You may not like the police, you may have had a bad run-in with some, but please hold your judgment of me and my story until it's finished. I work in a fairly remote area of Nebraska. In fact, there are only 10 full-time Leos in our county outside of our chief, and let me tell you, our days are long and sometimes boring, but they can also be intense, and stuff happens that burn memories into your soul. One afternoon, I was midway through a double. That's 20 hours straight with 4 overtime hours, one of the only perks we get through our union. I was lucky enough to be close to home and was having an early supper with my wife and kids before heading back out. Again, another perk. It's great to be able to see your family for a bit in the middle of your workday. Lots of people don't have that. I'll never forget, we were having spaghetti that my wife made, and I was happy because a hot meal on a cold afternoon and night hit the spot. It was early November when this happened. As I kissed my wife and bounced my son up and down on my knee, I went 10-8 and headed out into the cold. Not long after I drove away from my house, the radio picked up and I heard it.
All units 1059, 911 dispatch is advising current 1034 at 2438 J Road. Ambulance is en route for suspected firearm discharge.
That wasn't too far from me, and I knew I'd likely be the first person there, and I had a suspicion of what was going on. We all knew that address well and who lived there. 34 in, 10-4, will advise upon arrival. Is this who I think it is? I said back.
Copy 34, yes it is. 911 is still connected with caller.
Great. Just fucking great. We all know who this family was, and we all hated going out there. My colleagues and I always keep things clean and never shirk on our duties, but this was the Smith family. Again, not their name, and I hate to admit I feel this way, but they were some of the most disgusting backwoods, middle-of-nowhere trolls anywhere in the United States. 12 of them living under one roof, welfare, a lot of teeth broken off at the gum line, just a sad, sad picture of America gone wrong. The father, Bill, hadn't worked a day in his life, and his wife, Belinda, was just a baby maker, and neither of them gave a shit about their kids or the quote-unquote house they lived in. They basically lived one step up from squalor, and like I said, we hated going out there. The only constant out there was trouble, booze, and calls to us. Sometime in the late 90s, they had gotten permission to get foster kids, and that's where I think most of the kids came from. Just another way to get money from the state and not have to do anything for it. The kids ranged from 22 all the way down to 7, and they were all crammed into a 3-bedroom farmhouse out in the middle of nowhere. No running water. It was just gross. So here I am, heading out to what I'm sure is a booze-fueled argument with one of them shooting off a firearm, when I see a figure running towards me on the road. It was a young girl, and she had blood on her pants and shirt. I knew right away she was one of the Smith clan. Radio 34 in 1079, I said into my radio, asking to go to our emergency channel.
Go ahead, 34,
she said after we flipped. I have a young female running towards me that looks severely injured on J Road about a mile from the Smith residence in the 1034 call. Please advise.
Copy, 34. Sergeant advises you to handle this situation. Units en route to disturbance call.
I pull over and immediately notice this young woman, maybe 12 or 13, and she has no shoes on and has a look of horror on her face. Blood has smeared her cheeks, and all I could think of was that last scene in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre with the young woman running for her life. Radio 1055 to location on J Road if possible. 1020 less than 1 mile from 2348 J Road. Female in distress. Leaving vehicle to assess.
10-4-34. Ambulance to your location. Should be there in minutes.
I get out of my Crown Vic and the young woman ran straight to me and I blocked her with my door. And she was crying and screaming and I asked her if she was shot or stabbed and where. I quickly pulled gloves on and told her that it was going to be okay, but I needed to know where she was hurt. And this is where it gets messed up. The little girl stops screaming and just stares at me for a minute. Then she bursts into tears and crumples to the ground. I move around my door and ask her again where she's hurt. And then I notice 2 things. A tear in her pants on her left thigh, a faint smear of blood on her khaki pants near her crotch, and blood on her face. She's blubbering and trying to talk to me, and I reach out for her arm and tell her that it's going to be okay. She was obviously cut or shot, as the tear in her thigh was reflective of something that grazed her and caused some decent bleeding, but it wasn't anything more than a fairly good slash. The girl then just started saying, "He did this. He did this. It's not my fault. It's not my fault." I told her it wasn't her fault, and then I could hear the ambulance roaring down the road behind me. I again checked her bleeding, and it was more gory than anything that was putting her in danger. But she was in light clothing in the freezing air, so I helped her up as the paramedics pulled up and jumped into action. 2 other cars drove around us on the way to the Smith farm, and I gave the EMS guys a bit of information that I had, and they got her inside and did their thing. I got back in my cruiser and radioed I was on my way up J Road. When I got there, 2 of my colleagues were already out of their vehicles, and from the chatter that I heard on the radio, 911 was still on the line, but no one was there anymore, talking back to them. Luke approached the door and banged on it, yelling out that we were there. "Sheriff's deputies, open the door." Nothing happens, but we can see people moving around inside and taking their good old time coming to the door. Pete and I head around the opposite sides of the house looking into the windows, but can't see anything through the shit caked all over them. Luke yells for us to come back to the front and the door is now open. Mr. Smith is standing there looking like the white trash POS he is and asks us what's all the fuss. Pete tells them about the 911 call, and in the excitement, I yell out about the little girl I just saw. The slob lets us in, and we ask for whomever is still on the 911 call. But Smith and his wife, who has now emerged from a back room stinking of BO, booze, and feces, says we're wrong and have no reason to be there. There is no one on 911. 2 more cars pull up. One is our sergeant, and he's not taking any bullshit from these people. He tells them they either play it straight or everyone's going to jail. Everything goes quiet. Then we can hear a muffled sound, and over the radio we're informed the call is still active, but again, no one is responding to the 911 dispatcher. "Where is the phone?" asks my sergeant. The 2 morons just look at one another, and Sarge points a finger at them and barks out, I want everyone in this farm accounted for right this second. Belinda lights up a cigarette. Sarge tells her to put it out, and Luke and Pete go outside to look around for the other kids. As I move towards the door Mrs. Smith came out of. The smell was awful as I walked down the hall, with the Smiths yelling at me that I had no right to be going there. Sarge held them at bay, telling them we were on a distress call and I did have the right to be there. I open a door and there are like 5 kids sitting on the floor playing some sort of board game, and they all look up at me scared. I gently ask if they are all right, and I get a lot of nods and vacant stares. A little boy asks if he was in trouble, and I said, "Why would you be in trouble?" "Mama says we'll be in trouble if you ask us anything." I shook my head no, and then asked if anyone had made a phone call to the police. Another little girl, the youngest I guessed, pointed to the wall, and I figured she meant the next room over. I smiled at her and backed out of the room and listened for the muffled sound. That's when I heard sobbing coming from a closet that had the door closed and a screwdriver wedged into a bar, keeping it shut. I cautiously opened the door after pulling out the screwdriver and shined my maglite into the face of a boy about 12 years old. He was crying and had a huge welt on his face that I knew would be bruising up in no time. "Come on out of there, partner. It's okay," I said. I heard a shriek from the fat woman and more yelling from Mr. Smith. "Did you call 911? The boy nodded, looking down. "Where's the phone?" I asked. He motioned to the other bedroom, and I asked him to show me. Suddenly, Mrs. Smith is right behind me screaming that I can't talk to her kid without her being there, and I shut the door and held it closed with my foot as the kid scrambled underneath what was supposed to be a bed, but was nothing more than a piece of plywood on some cinder blocks. He reached under it and handed me a cell phone that was still open, with dispatch still on the line. They knew we were on the scene, but it stayed on the line just in case. Mrs. Smith is going completely apeshit now, and a female sheriff, let's call her Trudy, has arrived and is handling her. "Is this your parents' phone?" I asked the little boy. He shook his head. I thought it odd that something like this would be out here at this shitbox. "Whose phone is it, my man?" "Maddie's," he said, barely above a whisper. It then dawned on me. Maddie. The only one of the older kids that was worth a shit. He was the only one who went to school and graduated, and he must have been about 19 by now. I knew he worked at the supermarket in town, and I know he wanted to go to community college, but he gave a lot of his money to his family because he knew his foster parents didn't take care of his brothers and sisters. "Does Maddie still live here? Where is he? Does he know you have his phone?" The boy nodded and told me that Maddie didn't live there anymore. He had a place with his girlfriend and was at work right now. He had been out there earlier and let his brother have the phone to play some games and was going to come back for it later that night. I asked him what happened, and through crying he told me a fucked up story of what had happened. Before Maddie had left, he had had words with Toby, a 16-year-old living there, about him being odd to his sister. It turns out that was the one I found on the road. The little guy couldn't say what was going on because he didn't understand it, but after Maddie left, Toby had taken his sister to the barn out back, and she had come back screaming out and bloodied in a bad way. This little guy said he wanted to call Maddie, but it kicked in that he had Maddie's phone, so he did the only thing he knew to do, and that was tell his father, Bill. Apparently Bill had told him to shut up, and that he didn't want cops around, and that's when the girl burst into the house with her clothes torn, screaming, and she was bleeding. Toby came in after her and chased her out the front door with a rifle, took a shot at her, grazing her leg. The kid grabbed the phone to try to call 911, and Belinda tried to stop him. He ran and hid the phone before both Bill and Belinda beat him and locked him in the closet. We accounted for all the kids, and CPS came out and took them all away, and the search for Toby was on. It didn't take long. We found the asshole just a few miles away on a road, kind of wandering around. So the full story is the worst. Toby was trying to get his sister to have sex, and when she wouldn't, he started hitting her, and that's when she got her first period, and barely understood what was happening to her biologically, let alone this physical beating. I'll never forget that poor little girl screaming to me that it wasn't her fault. That's the kind of thing that stays with you. The kids went into different foster care, and 2 older ones who weren't there at the time moved away. The state pressed Bill and Belinda with a bunch of abuse, negligence, and obstruction charges, you name it. They both got time and are still serving sentences. Toby got out of Junior Disneyland Hotel, this sick little shit, but I heard he's back in jail for something else, but it didn't happen around here, so I'm not really sure what it was. I still see Matty once in a while, and I was always told by people in court that he hadn't forgiven himself for not being there for his sister and family, and that he still beats himself up about not taking care of them. I did run into him at a softball game one night, and I pulled him aside and told him that he had done enough, and that he and his little brother had saved their sister. If he hadn't have let that little kid play with his phone that night, the 911 call never would have been made, and things could have been a lot worse. Please don't take this as a story about blasting foster care. Foster care is a great thing, but there are some sick people out there, and it makes me angry that the system misses them from time to time. I've got lots more stories. I know this was super long, and I'm sure your peeps are ready for your next story, but I hope you read this. Take care. The Weird Screams. I once was called to a residence out in the boonies. This was in Wyoming, so the boonies really are the boonies. It was about 11 p.m., and it was about some suspicious activity. When my partner and I got there, we were told by the family living there that there were some very strange screams coming from a creek area about 1,000 feet behind their house. Sure enough, waiting outside on the porch with them for about a minute, I heard it. It was very hard to describe what it sounded like. It was like a woman in very severe distress, but higher pitched, and each scream lasted for about 10 or 15 seconds. It never sounded like it was saying anything. It just sounded like a cry of sheer terror, and it repeated itself over and over. We told the family we were going to investigate, so we just walked down to the creek since it was pretty nice out. We hear about 2 more screams, and they were getting louder as we approached the creek. By now, we're both kind of freaked out. There are 2 possibilities. Someone is getting murdered or maimed out in this creek bed, or maybe it's just a wild animal. As we approach the creek bed, we hear no screams for about 5 minutes. We search around and find nothing, yelling at the top of our lungs for somebody to come forward if they're out there. Then, we hear the exact same scream right behind us, exactly from where we had just come from. We got about halfway back to the house, and the scream came so loudly it seemed to be coming right next to us. We frantically shone our flashlights everywhere, found nothing. No eyes from animals, no rustling of bushes, just silence. We trace our steps back, and the scream comes from around the creek again. This time it lasted about 30 seconds and was much louder than before. Our retreat became a little more hastened. By this time we were both scared shitless and verified with the family to call us again if they heard it. And they never did call again, and we just got the hell out of there. I still don't know what that was. I mean, as an avid outdoorsman, I know no animal makes a cry like that, especially one that can move stealthily without being spotted by flashlights. Something else that weirded me out was that it was completely silent while the screams were happening. During summer in Wyoming, there is always some type of ambient animal sounds. Frogs croaking, crickets, owls hooting, coyotes, etc., but there was nothing. Until we were leaving and the screams had stopped. Then the frogs started croaking. Man, it gives me the creeps just thinking about it still. The Horrendous Father. I live in a fairly small town. My dad was a cop for 10 years or so. My aunt works in the ER going on 11 years now. And at the time of this story, one of my best friend's brother-in-law was an EMT. They were all involved in this sick tale. One night there was a call about a domestic dispute. Then a 911 call from the same address from a woman who was just screaming and was then cut off. Of course, all kinds of units were sent immediately. It turned out a guy was high on drugs and had a freak out on his girlfriend, accusing her of cheating. He beat the shit out of her, broke several of her bones, and then he decided their 3-month-old baby wasn't his, picked up the infant by his feet and gutted him with a box cutter. When the cops showed up, he was beating on his girlfriend some more with a kitchen utensil. She was huddled over the baby, trying to shield him with her own body. They got the guy subdued, rushed the baby to the ER, attended to the woman in the ambulance out front, and sewed up several cuts on the man in the kitchen. The EMT tending to him was my friend's brother-in-law. The man was still on a high, but coming down and saying a lot of disgusting things about his girlfriend. My friend's brother-in-law slammed his head into the refrigerator, warning him to stop talking. A sergeant was in the room, saw this, and gave the EMT an approving nod. A few minutes later, the sergeant got fed up with the man's clearly unapologetic words and said, "Do you hear that woman crying? She trusted you to take care of her, loved you enough to give you a son, and look what you've done to both of them. She didn't cheat. We know you never let her leave the house, so how could she cheat? That little boy is your son, and you could have been a father to him and raised him to be a great man. Now you've taken his life. That woman who loved you so much is out there weeping because she's just lost her son and her boyfriend. Don't you care at all?" The man then said that if the baby didn't want him to kill it, it should have died before it was born, and that the woman deserved what she got because she was a dumb bitch, cheating or not. The sergeant lost his temper and shot the guy in the foot. My father witnessed all of this and later had to testify. My aunt said in the ER the baby was lying there and his intestines were literally laying next to him on a gurney, outside of his body. Every single person who worked on that baby requested therapy afterwards. The mom had some pretty bad internal bleeding, but my aunt said the most disturbing thing was hearing her scream for her baby. She said in all her years in the ER, she's never heard anyone scream like that. The mom and the baby actually both lived, but the baby had some serious brain damage because he didn't get enough oxygen to his brain because of a punctured lung. And the guy is in prison. I know he got drug charges, weapons charges, I guess there were unregistered guns found in the home as well as more drugs, domestic battery, attempted murder, and a few other things I'm not even sure of. I do know he had a long sentence, but I'm not sure how long. It's been a while. The sergeant and EMT were both fired for what they did to that guy that day. That was the hearing my dad had to testify in, along with some other officers and EMTs. The door at the end of the hall. Myself and a buddy on my squad responded to an alarm one night. The incident location was an old office building that had been converted to doctor's offices. There was a pharmacy attached to it, and our dispatch received a motion signal from an upstairs office. The key holder arrives on the scene, and we go in to secure the building. The stairs were locked behind a door that, of course, the key holder didn't have the keys to, so we took the elevator up to the second floor. Not the most tactically sound option, I know. The elevator opens to a pitch-black hallway, except for one overhead light at the end of the hall. We start checking doors, and so far all are secured. We get to the last office, and sure enough, the door is unlocked. We make entry and observe it to be an unused office. The door opened to a sizable waiting room and reception area, and there were about 10 or 12 exam rooms, all cleared with no hiccups. We exit the office, and immediately something seems off. That's when I realized the overhead light at the end of our hallway that had been on was now off, replaced by another light over by the elevators. I look at my squad mate. He is completely white. I ask him what he thinks is wrong, and he says, "Weren't all those doors we just checked closed and locked?" I said, "Yeah, so?" "Well, now they're all standing open." Sure enough, all the offices down the hallway we had just checked were now standing open. Pucker factor sinks in at this point. So we start clearing offices and securing offices, and we finish the last one, and on our way out, just before we turn the corner to get into the waiting area, the main door just slams shut. Then, our radios start going nuts with some kind of static feedback. And now I just want to get the hell out of there. We get back in the elevator and head down to the first floor to make contact with the key holder again. However, the key holder is nowhere to be found. I contact dispatch and request a callback number for the key holder so I can advise them of what we'd found. Dispatch states that the key holder was still en route to us and was advising an ETA of 5 more minutes. I advised dispatch that we had already been out with the key holder. Dispatch requests I give him a call. I do call in, and the dispatcher tells me there is no way we were out there with a key holder. She states that the alarm company had only just made contact with one. Eventually, the real key holder arrives on scene, and I ask her about the man that had let us in the building, the first key holder. She asked me to describe him, so I did. She states that sounds like it's one of the doctors that used to lease the office on the 2nd floor, at the end of the hall. She then states that he had committed suicide at his summer home several days ago. I still won't go back to that office building.